1650 to 1900. So let's open in prayer. Again, Lord, we do thank you for the recorded church history, which is very valuable to us as we learn from it positives and negatives and are encouraged by the movement of the gospel. So we're thankful for it. Give us open minds and open hearts to learn. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. So again, this is Revival and Missions, 1650 to 1900, and you should have an outline. And here again, the outlines I give are pretty basic, and you can fill in whatever you want. It's just to kind of keep you moving along with what I'm going to talk about. And at the bottom of the outline, you do have the bibliography, which is the source of the lecture. Tim Daly, Erdman's Handbook to History of Christianity, Bruce Shelley, Church History in Plain Language, which is actually the main textbook for the lecture. And then Ruth Tucker, From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya. And whenever necessary, I will anecdote direct quotes. So as we examine this phase, I realize that we may not agree with all the tenets of these people and movements, but we want to focus on their strengths and learn from their deficiencies with a humble attitude. I'm following the general stream of church history from the conservative perspective. So you may be versed in some areas and know some ambiguities, but as is the case with all historical surveys and application, selectivity is exercised. And that's what I'm doing. I've selected certain people, movements, to the neglect of others purposely, because we only have so much time. So as you have your outline there, the first area that I want to consider in lieu of the movement of revival and missions is the effect of religious wars. Now, as I just briefly survey these, religious wars were not always exclusively religious, and we know that for a fact just in the present circumstances in our own country, but I'll just list some here. France, 1562 to 1598. This was pretty much a conflict between the Catholics and the Huguenots were the French Calvinists. And this ended with the Edict of Nantes at 1598. 1540 to 1550, Germany's the scene. Lutheran princes were fighting Catholic forces. And this pretty much ended with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. And at that stage of the game, each ruler then would decide the religion for his territory. And that's a very significant point, and we're going to see why that's critical. The 30-Year War in Germany, 1618 to 1648, was a very protracted conflict, and again, it was pretty much Protestant versus Catholic. The Swedes were involved, Denmark was involved, and there was some other political overtones, undertones, etc. involved. And this ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. But the interesting result about this conflict was then the princes could determine for their territory whether they could choose to be Catholic or Protestant, and that's quite a big step. We're familiar with the English Civil War. We had talked about that. That was in the mid-1700s. But the Dutch also fought a war of deliverance from Catholic Spain, 1560 through 1618. Why mention these wars? Because as we move into the next area, which is just the Age of Reason, which we're going to talk about very briefly, it became obvious that people were starting to get weary of religious conflicts. And that definitely had a mind shift for the populace at large. It would have been interesting to get the reflections of the common peasant at that point and see what their consensus was about this. And as I was thinking this through, I was just reminded of, I forget what politician said this in the United States, but I think it was in the context of the 1960s and the Vietnam War. And he said, I'm tired of old men dreaming up wars for young men to die in. Again, that's quite a loaded statement. I'm tired of old men dreaming up wars for young men to die in. So in lieu of that and these religious wars, again, we're realizing that there was major issues at hand, but you often have to wonder that the powers that be, if just their religious preference was the guiding factor, or it was deeper than that, with political aspirations, with power. And we'll see at the end in the application, we'll discuss that issue, particularly in lieu of what's going on in the Western civilization today. So that launches us then into the Age of Reason, and this is about 1648 to 1789. And we're just briefly going to survey this, but the emphasis in the Age of Reason now, as people's minds are starting to change, particularly in lieu of these wars and other factors, was pretty much behavior, not dogma. So they wanted to carry on I suppose you'd say it this way, Christian morality, but yet they didn't want the dogma behind it. So there's a tension here. A new authority, the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, is slowly being put aside, as well as in the Protestant realm, there's a challenge to the authority of the Scripture. And human reason surfaces in some context. Now, I'm not saying this was an overarching philosophy through the age. It was there. And quite interestingly, Bruce Shelley in his book lists Benjamin Franklin as a classic example of this new idea. And I'll read an excerpt from the book, and I quote from his book. A few weeks before he died, Ben Franklin responded to an inquiry by President Edward Stiles of Yale concerning his religious faith. Said Franklin, quote, "As to Jesus of Nazareth, I have some doubts as to his divinity, though it is a question I do not dogmatize on, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble. I see no harm, however, in it being believed, if that belief has good consequence of making his doctrines more respected and better observed," end of quote. So again, there's sort of a laissez-faire attitude in some contexts to principled, dogmatic theological approaches. And again, we don't want to make the mistake that this was overarching. But in the context of this, we still have the rise of modern science. And we had discussed that in a lecture last year, Theology and Science, how, yes, modern science was still sustained on, let's just say, a biblical worldview with a creator and an organized universe. But the pervading idea in this movement was that man could find truth through his own sense and reason. Question the depravity of man was a natural result of that. Then what arose from that, and you're probably familiar with this term, excuse me, deism. And that sort of found its way into the repertoire of even some of our founding fathers, Franklin as well as Jefferson. But in this context, excuse me, the name Voltaire surfaces, and he was pretty much the main proponent of it. And this idea is there was a supreme being who created the world and left it go, and that's, you've, I'm sure, heard the illustration of the watchmaker that made the watch and wound it up and just left it go. But eventually the system did collapse, and there was apologists who confronted it, Butler in England. But there's a significant development that surfaced after the collapse of this ideology, and in Shelley's words, that Christianity then never again regained its position as the pillar of Western civilization. And that doesn't mean there wasn't Christian movements and strengths surfacing in various countries, but again, I like the way that's phrased, that it never again regained the position as the pillar of Western civilization. So in light of that, then, and as you have your outline there, we have some reactions from the Christian community. And we're going to look at three. We're going to look at the Pietists, the Methodists, and the Great Awakening. And I emphasize this is from the general movement of Christianity as church history states it. So particularly with the Pietists, let's give them a fair hearing, and I encourage that. Let's give them a fair hearing because they had a lot to contribute. And the context of the growth of this movement was German Lutheranism was beginning to grow stale. And out of it came some men who sensed this and were wanting to, let's just say, get it back on track with an experiential Christianity that emphasized the new birth. The main figure that surfaces initially is a Lutheran pastor, Philip Spener, 1635 to 1705. He was influenced by the writings of Johann Arndt as well as the English Puritans. Okay, so and just remember this: the English Puritans were very heavy emphasis on experiential Christianity, doctrinal experiential Christianity mixed, and talked about that last time. But Spener came to realize that if you're going to get the true understanding of justification, then this did warrant a experiential new birth. And he had a pastorate in Frankfurt, and he began preaching from the whole Scripture and began to emphasize biblical repentance, discipleship, small group gatherings, an aesthetic pursuit of holiness. And again, this is in the backdrop of what had appeared in Germany, at least in certain contexts, a dryness in the Lutheran Church. It appears that the whole concept of a mental assertion of the truths to believe were there, but not this experiential vein. So in 1669, in his context, there was what appeared to be an awakening. And this is where the term, I think, pietist comes from, because these people were called, quote, the gathering of the pious. And I think that in some respects it was a term that was a scornful term. And that they did not attempt to leave the Lutheran Church. They just wanted to reform it from the inside out. And Spener then recommended a man named Hermann Franke to the professorship at Halle, and he eventually went to Leipzig. But Halle pretty much, University of Halle, pretty much became the hub of this pietist movement. Franke became its leaders, and the next name that we're going to deal with was one of Franke's disciples. And interestingly, George Mueller was affected by this movement as well, and I'll talk about him in the end. He was the man who had the orphanage movement in England in the 1900s. But the essential contribution of this movement, and we'll list some at the end of this segment, but it really pushed a missionary thrust. And what's very interesting is one of Franke's early disciples was a missionary in India. And this, again, was before the great push, which we're going to talk about. But the name that's probably most frequently attached with this movement is a name that you're probably familiar with, Count von Zinzendorf. And von Zinzendorf had studied under Franke and became a missionary statesman. And that's a very significant term that I want to use about him. But this pietist movement as we call it, flourished through the Bohemian Brethren. And the Bohemian Brethren were a group that was persecuted, and they were led by a Moravian carpenter named Christian David. And they were seeking a refuge from persecution, and they ended up on von Zinzendorf's estates. And they developed a monastic community, Herrnhut, the Lord's Watch, and eventually Zinzendorf rose to become leader of the movement. And if you look into it, yes, there was some deficiencies in it and some controversy, as is the case in any Christian movement. But the overriding strength that came out of this movement, as Shelley says, and I quote, Moravians became the first large-scale Protestant missionary force in history, end quote. So they were St. Thomas, Greenland, Lapland, American Indians, Africa, South America, etc. And they were noted for a prayer vigil which started about this time and went on around the clock for 100 years. The vigil started in about 1727, and they had a prayer vigil again for 100 years. And that's quite a notable, let's just say, adage of describing them. But some of their strengths, and obviously before we get into it, one of their weaknesses was the monasticism. They didn't engage society the way they should have, even though, let's just say this, if you give them a fair reading, the trickle-down of their emphasis did affect the world that they live in. But as Shelley lists these, their emphasis kind of nudged the church to move away from controversy to conversion of souls. Not that wasn't there before, but it seemed to have been consuming the church. And if you look at the Reformation, and even just the the tension between Zwingli and Luther over the Eucharist, you realize that in many cases it didn't derail the Reformation, but it certainly hindered it in many ways. Another emphasis that came out of this movement was just the importance of preaching pastoral concerns and the pastor doing the job as a shepherd. Visitation, etc. They seem to have enhanced Christian music, and they definitely encouraged a cultivation of a spiritual laity. And again, that's something we take just for granted today, but it perhaps wasn't there in that context. I think that what I'm kind of reading between the lines was more of the professional ministry, and there's a place for that, but boy, the emphasis of the spiritual laity doing the work of the church. They emphasize small groups, personal study, and the promise of an experiential new birth. And that's quite critical. And just a head acknowledgement of the truth, the historical truths, is not sufficient. There has to be a regenerated heart, as we know. So, again, the movement did not attempt to dislodge the institutional church. It just attempted to bring revival in it. Another movement, the Methodists, and this was primarily in the British Isles. And as we consider this movement, one name surfaces among some of the other greats who weren't Methodists in the sense that John Wesley was, but you had Whitefield, Howell Harris, the Erskine brothers, and they were contemporaries with Wesley to some degree, and we've talked about Whitefield before. But as we consider Wesley, 1703 to 1791, we want to emphasize his impact on England at that time, and then the consequent result, and that you have that on your outline there, the Methodists. And he raised in an Anglican home, and his mother was the famous Susanna Wesley, and you probably know that name. And I know even in homeschooling circles, some of her methodologies, the way she taught her children are there and made reference to. So she has quite an honorable name. But Wesley attended Oxford, was ordained an Anglican minister, led the Holy Club at Oxford. And when we dealt with Whitefield, we had talked about this. This was a group of young men at Oxford who were very serious about pursuing the disciplines of the Christian faith. However, Wesley was not even regenerated at that point. And his next move was that he went to America to be a missionary, and he failed dramatically in America, mainly because at that point he wasn't even a believer when he went there. He returned as a failure, and in his own words, he says this, and I quote, "I went to America as a missionary to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me?" End of quote. But again, what's quite interesting is that Wesley was even influenced by the Moravians on his way to America. And Shelley gives us a record of this, as Wesley was going to America, the ship had experienced some pretty tempestuous seas, and I quote, "As the sea broke over the deck of the vessel, splitting the mainsail in pieces, the Moravians calmly sang their psalms to God. Afterward, Wesley asked one of the Germans if he was frightened, and no, he replied. Weren't your women and children afraid? Wesley asked. No, said the Moravian, our women and children are not afraid to die. This, Wesley wrote in his journal, was the most glorious day I've ever seen. End of quote. So Wesley does return to London, a failure, but again, he runs into another Moravian, Peter Bowler, and he has an effect on his life. But then eventually Wesley is converted, and you probably know the story at Aldersgate Society there. He's sitting in a group that's reading the preface to Luther's commentary on Romans, and he is consequently converted. So he goes back to, and he never actually left it, but he went back into the Anglican Church thinking that he was going to function in that context. And in the meantime, he's reading Jonathan Edwards' accounts of the Great Awakening in the United States. And what it appears with Wesley, his spirit's beginning to stir. But his natural, let's just say, reaction is, no, I'll just go back into the Church of England and minister there. But it was good old Whitefield who had been preaching at Bristol, and there was major revivals there. And he was encouraging Wesley to come up to preach at Bristol. And the proper John Wesley did, despite his own feelings and drawbacks, and the match was lit. And let's just say there was an explosion in his ministry. So this 6-year-old boy that was dramatically saved from a parsonage fire now enters the world stage as, let's just say, on par with Whitefield now. And we know there was controversy between their two, some aspects of their soteriology, and they eventually reconciled at the end, but they just did their own thing. And this guy, Wesley, and this is quite notable, traveled 250,000 miles on horseback in his preaching tenure. Imagine that. That's the whole way to the moon. Okay, I think the moon is about 240-some thousand miles. So if you think about it, he rode his horse to the moon. And he organized societies and just developed what we have as, let's just say, modern-day Methodism, never leaving the Church of England. He was very vehement. No, I'm not going to leave the Church of England. Very much like the original Moravians wanting to stay in the Lutheran Church. He was married, but that didn't work out too well. His wife just couldn't keep up with the schedule, and they just, I think, amiably parted, if you want to call it that way, and he proceeded on with his ministry, and she just lived out the rest of her life. He died in 1791 at 88, preaching almost to the end. Now, he lived much longer than Whitefield, and Whitefield, as we talked about previously, he just flat out burned out, and he died in the United States. But Wesley seemed to have continued on, and again, is quite a notable career of, let's just say, fervor for the preaching of the gospel. And again, while some of his theology we wouldn't concur with, we have to respect his zeal. And even the movement of this Methodism into the United States. Now, the Methodism in the United States actually became a separate denomination at that point. Again, Wesley never wanted to leave the Anglican Church. But what's interesting, as was the case with Whitefield and others, that this really inspired a moral revolution in the working classes in England. And when we did our study on Whitefield, if you remember, England was consumed in what we call the gin craze. Cheap gin was just destroying the whole society. And there were others who were influenced by this, notably Wilberforce, not just in his dealing with slavery, but just pushing for moral reform in the society along with the gospel. And there's another name that surfaces, that Hannah More, who was actually a friend of Wilberforce's, and she wrote simple tracts with moral tales and distributed them in mass as just trying to influence the people for a better life. We know that Wilberforce also was a writer, and his classic work, A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians in the Higher and Middle Classes in this country, contrasted with real Christianity. So Wilberforce seemed to appeal to the higher classes, and some of these other people were trying to work with the working classes. That brings us to another movement, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and that is the Great Awakening in the U.S., and I have that on your outline there. And what appeared to be happening in the U.S., there was a decline in the true Puritan vitality. And again, the Puritans, as we dealt with them in the 1700s, particularly in England, there was a strong emphasis, again, on light and heat, the experiential Christianity. But what appeared to be happening in the American colonies, this vitality was draining. So we see the stirrings, the winds blowing between 1720, 1740 in New Jersey under a Dutch Reformed minister, Theodore Friedensburg, serving in a farm community, preaching doctrinal Christianity, the gospel, and the movement started to stir. It carried over into the Presbyterian denomination, the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians in that area. And it came from a movement known as the Log College, started by a guy named William Tennant. Now, the interesting thing about this movement, there was a high emphasis on personal regeneration as well as evangelical zeal. But there was another faction in Presbyterianism that pushed back against it, which appeared to be somewhat of more educated per se, and I don't think they liked the evangelical zeal of some of these ministers. But this movement then spread on down into Virginia and into the South. 1734, you go north, and you know where you're going to arrive at. You're going to arrive at Northampton, Massachusetts. And this is where Jonathan Edwards is pastoring, and there's stirrings there as well. But with Whitefield's arrival in 1739, the whole eastern seaboard, if you want to say it that way, as you well know, erupted. And he came to the United States 7 times, and there was a massive, massive revival. And Shelley, in his book, estimates that between 25,000 and 50,000 members were added to the New England churches alone. But one of the side results of this movement was a guy named Isaac Backus. And Isaac Backus became a Baptist, and he was the head of the Baptist church in Middleborough, Massachusetts. But with him started a movement to make sure that the United States didn't adopt a state church. So he pushed back against this pretty hard. And I think you're familiar with what went on there. But the point that we have to make about him was how critical it was to let these various denominations begin to function under the guise of general Christendom. So there's fruits of these movements, as your outline says, and we want to emphasize two of them, and one being just social change itself, and how much these movements promoted social change. And then we want to talk about the big missionary push as well. And we've discussed that before. But many evangelical groups arose in Britain in the late 1700s, 1800s as a result of the revival preaching. So again, it's surfacing in lieu of a nominal Church of England, which was not at all experiential, but let's just say, if you could, I think in my own understanding, Christianity was more of a cultural thing. But these revivalists, Wesley, Whitefield, others, the Erskines, Howell Harris, and the list goes on, stirred the awakening of the need for personal regeneration and then a sanctified life. But one particular group stands out in this movement, and again, we made allusion to this before when we did Wilberforce, and that's the Clapham sect. And Shelley says this about him, and I quote, "These were ardent evangelicals who knew what it was to practice saintliness in daily life and to live with eternity in view," end of quote. And I must emphasize that this group was a very wealthy cartel of people. It didn't come from the middle classes. So they definitely were affected by the revival preaching of Whitefield as well as Wesley. And Clapham was located right outside of London, and this is where they met. And the interesting thing about them, that they weren't just an entity in themselves. They were guided by the famous pastor John Venn, and you probably know that name, local parish church. And they met for prayer, edification, Bible study, often at the house of a wealthy banker, John Thornton. How did they get accomplished what they did? And we'll list just the beginning of some of their accomplishments. Well, they conducted what they called cabinet councils to plan how to confront the societal injustice. So it was a very, let's just say, purposeful movement that was very much involved in politics. And if you do your homework, some of the reformations in the East India Company in India were a result of this group and others. But the list only begins with 1799, the Church Missionary Society, 1864, eventually the British Foreign Bible Society came out of this movement. The Society for the Bettering the Condition of the Poor, 1796. The Society for Reformation of Prison Discipline, Reform. But above all, they're noted for their work with Wilberforce in the abolition of slavery. Shelley says this about them, and I quote, "The Clapham sect learned two basics of politics in democracy. Number one, how to create public opinion, and number two, how to bring the pressure of opinion on the government," end of quote. And that, I think, especially was worked out in the whole move for the abolition of slavery. Again, creating public opinion in the direction that they wanted them to go, the moral direction, and then managing this public opinion in the legislative body. Another movement that came out of this, and we've talked about this before, again, is the birth of modern missions. So it's not that missions had halted, and even if you go back to Calvin, he sent evangelists back up to France, but he actually had some missionary endeavors, and I believe it was into the West Indies, that didn't succeed, but he at least tried. So it wasn't that missions was dead. It's just that the big push had not started. Remember, the Moravians were nudging it, and we've talked about William Carey, and we've called him the father of modern missions. And we've also talked about Adoniram Judson to Burma and how important they were in not just launching out, but getting the local church to do the work, to say, okay, we need to create this vision. But I want to stop at a noteworthy name that I think is well worth mentioning, maybe for my own interests, because of what I've been thinking through and studying. And this is David Livingstone, 1813 to 1873. So although Livingstone was a missionary to Africa, he was also a world-class explorer. In many ways, he was a Victorian hero. And a quite interesting story I would recommend you read is how H.M. Stanley found him. That Dr. Livingstone, I presume, is true. It's actually happened. And that's just by side note, and Stanley was eventually converted by the testimony of Livingstone. But I'm particularly fond of Livingstone because although he was very purposed on evangelism, he desperately wanted to open Africa up to commerce and Christian civilization with the intention of encouraging the Africans to not be involved in the slave trading. I mean, they were involved in the sense of raiding other tribes and providing slaves for the Arab slave traders, and then unfortunately the Europeans, etc. But he was thinking, well, if I can open these trade routes up in Africa, then encourage the Africans to sell their produce, their forest wares, etc., to white civilization. He called it the open sore of the world. So again, the reason I like Livingstone is he had a mindset to bring civilization, Christian civilization, to this continent for higher purposes other than just his own personal aggrandizement or even colonial aggrandizement. That's another discussion. But it's just worth walking through his life a little bit, because there's other people, if you study missions, and I do highly recommend this book, From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya, Ruth Tucker, lots of short missionary biographies. He's born in Scotland to a poor family, very pious family, 10-year-old working in the cotton mills, okay, from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., all right? That was pretty normal at that time. This is the Industrial Revolution. Self-taught in some respects, as the story says. He says his Latin grammar there on the cotton gin, or whatever it was called, studying and learning. He eventually goes to night school and does go to medical school. He was going to go to China, but because of political situation, that didn't work out. He's influenced by Robert Moffat, the great missionary to South Africa. He was a giant as well, and he warrants your study. And he did eventually. He went to Africa in 1840, settled at the Qumran mission station, which Moffat had developed, and always had an itching to go further in, all right, to go deeper into the interior, all right. Now let me just say that's a notable quality, because having lived in Africa myself, I was never too interested in, let's just say, getting off the mainstream of the roads and where I lived, the mission station I worked in. But he had this interest, and he eventually marries Moffat's daughter, 1845, and he begins these missionary endeavors, moving up from South Africa further north in South Africa, taking his wife and children along, and that didn't work out too well, because at some point I think he had 5 children. She eventually goes back to England, 1852, and just kind of fades off the scene. And this, frankly, is a blot on Livingstone's character, That's what some would say, because she didn't do well back in England. But at that point, 11 years of missionary endeavor, and he didn't have much to show. But then the next phase of his life is these 3 explorations with the intention of opening Africa up to commerce and overthrowing the still slave trade being practiced there, even though England had outlawed it earlier in the century. Others were involved in it. So again, there's a lot of controversy to him as whether he was a successful missionary or not. But again, I think he's a good model that he seemed to get it, because he said, I want to further Christian civilization for the benefit of these people. Another name surfaces, and this lady broke the mold, okay? And here again, she's well worth, I've read a full biography on her, Mary Slessor, and she was, excuse me, Scottish as well. But the reason I like her, not just because of her zeal, but she breaks the prototype. You know, some of contemporary, quote, anthropologists, if you want to call them that, have a habit of bashing missionaries. They've destroyed the culture, and even associating them with the negatives of colonialism. Although colonialism had a lot of positives, that's another discussion. There's quite a good book that's just come out on that, A Moral Reckoning on Colonialism by Nigel Bigger. I've read that. I highly encourage you to read that. But Mary Slessor's life was characterized by sacrifice and service to the Africans, as we'll see. Born in Scotland, 1848, hard upbringing, alcoholic father who used to throw her out in the street, as was the case with Livingston. Began working in the textile mills at 11 years old. Converted as a child, active in the Presbyterian Church, worked in Queen Street Mission there in Scotland, and eventually at 27 wanted to go to Calabar, Nigeria. 1876 was the time she's accepted. She goes and is living on the coast in Duketown, where the missionaries had, let's just say, congregated and worked. And again, sometimes those types of people are criticized. And even in Livingston's experience as well, some of those missionaries who would just stay on the coast or in areas and wouldn't go up in, saw the same thing in India as well as China. But boy, I don't begrudge them, because you go up into Africa, you're getting into some pretty heavy stuff: malaria, animals, disease, danger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But some of these people had this inkling to just go in, and I'm glad they did. And she was one of them. And before she was able to do that, she had suffered from malaria, homesickness, did a 3-year furlough, and then came back, rested, and just fired up to do this. So again, this is a single woman, Mary Slessor. This is the Victorian age, okay? So she's definitely breaking the mold in a lot of ways. So she continues to do that, and the rest of her career is just moving up into the interior. And she pretty much lived native, if you want to say it that way. Slept in mud huts, ate the food, roaches, rats. Wasn't overtly concerned with her own health, but seemed to do well. She had a lot of accomplishments: basic medical work, mediated disputes in the tribal settings, a peacemaker. It was her opinion that women as pioneer missionaries were a good thing, because the African chiefs weren't intimidated by them. So she had quite a, let's just say, ministry doing that. She opposed that twin murder, which was common. So if twins were born, they were murdered, okay? That was one of the cultural things. And when you have the cultural anthropologists challenging that, I like to say, well, that's a pretty depraved practice. It's like seti in India, the burning of widows. She, interestingly, became the first vice consul to Okayong, a government position, as a judge. And I just read a biography of Alan Burns, who was worked in the colonial system a little later than this, but that's quite commendable that she had that position. And it was definitely a benefit to the Africans, and they loved her. She established trade routes, organized schools, cared for a whole host of adopted children who just somehow or another she picked them up. Died at 66. But again, why consider her model of sacrifice? She forego getting married. She was going to get married in midlife, and the man that she was going to marry had some health problems, and he had to return to England, and they couldn't get married. So she sacrificed that. But she is very pertinent to the statement I made at the beginning that a lot of times people castigate these missionaries. I said, wait a second, you better do your homework. And this even happens in the Christian community. I said, just do your homework on these people and make sure that you know what you're talking about when you start speaking overtly negative about them, because their sacrifices were just unbelievable. And in many cases, their focus on the benefit of indigenous peoples was there. As the same was with the colonial governments. And like I said, that's not a very political correct statement, but if you start doing your homework, you'll begin to realize that there's some truth to the latter statement. So, other giants of the age, you probably know the name George Mueller, the man who had started the orphanages at Bristol. And we know him for his amazing prayer life, never making his needs known, just praying and God's provision for his orphanage. He was actually a disciple of the German pietists in his early life. So again, that tells you something about their influence. Another name, and you know it, Charles Spurgeon, 1834 to 1892, converted in 1850 while listening to a primitive Methodist preacher, okay? So you know the story. He was out in the rain, inducted into this church, primitive Methodist church. I think he was about 15 or so, and here's the gospel. And the guy wasn't even the regular preacher. And if my memory serves me correct, Spurgeon's estimation of him as a preacher wasn't that high, but it was through that guy's ministry. He pointed Spurgeon out and that he was converted. And you know as well as I do, he rose to be called, as you know, the Prince of Preachers. So at 20, he's pastoring he wasn't quite 20, pastoring the Park Street Chapel, and then it went on from 1861, 1891, preached at the Metropolitan Tabernacles. 6,000 people, started the Pastor's College. Sermons published weekly till 1917, and many, many other accomplishments. And what's interesting about Spurgeon, if you know, he suffered horrendously from the good old Puritan dark night of the soul, chronic depression. But he accomplished so much under that umbrella. And his sermons are still being published. You know, I have them on my shelf. So there's a lot to learn from his life, and I highly recommend Dallamore's biography of him. Another name, D.L. Moody, 1837 to 1899. And Spurgeon supported Moody's campaign in England, okay? So to Spurgeon's credit, again, there's probably some theological differences there, but Moody's born into a Unitarian family. Father dies at 4. At 17, he's working in his uncle's shoe shop. He's converted through Edward Kimball, a Sunday school teacher, all right? So there you go. How you never know who you're going to run into. And your personal witness, you never know how far it's going to go. So it's so worthwhile to just evangelize personally, because you may fade off into oblivion and you just don't know who you're going to affect. So he moves to Chicago. He's a businessman, very ardent church worker, and then goes into full-time Christian work. And his tour of Britain, 1873 to 75, is pretty much what put him on the international stage. Well, there's other names, and there's hundreds of them, and I leave them to your pursuit. And one other in the missionary category, Hudson Taylor, 1832 to 1905, founder of the China Inland Mission. And again, he if you study Mueller's life, you'll come across Hudson Taylor, and some of these people, they interweave in the network, just like we have our networks. Great organizer. The mission grew to almost 800 people under him. By 1914, it was the largest mission in the world. But like Slessor and Livingston and Carey and Judson, they were motivated to keep pushing up into the interior, and not to the discredit of those who stayed on the coastal regions. They had their ministries, but Taylor, when you think about him and you think about the church in China now, I can't help but think he laid that foundation for what we're seeing in China. But the other interesting thing about Taylor, he's another guy that broke the mold, because he went native in his dress, and that didn't go over too good in the Victorian society in China there. But nonetheless, he was a success in many ways. But his Spiritual Secrets is a book worth reading, as well as others, because their Christian dynamic and the way they live their lives and interacted with the challenges they face is of great benefit. So that brings us to some applications. As far as religious wars, we talked about them, and what we often see is they do send a mixed message to bystanders, don't they? And that's what we saw of, quote, intolerance. So I think that we have to be somewhat careful in the way that we analyze this, and even the way we come across and approach things. And in our context now, our evangelism is in the backdrop of religious wars, even in Western civilization, as we stand here right now. The Age of Reason, while apologetics is important, if you notice that it was the propositional preaching, in my opinion, of Whitefield and others who dethroned some of these errant ideas. And again, I'm a fan of apologetics. But ultimately, as you well know, the blindness is moral, and they need to be regenerated. And that doesn't mean, and it depends, I suppose, on what type of apologetics you're into, but it doesn't ultimately, let's just say, rely on the evidence that we present. It's helpful, but it doesn't ultimately rely on that. God has to open their eyes and regenerate them. The Pietists, we can learn from their experiential Christianity and how much of a benefit it was, but we want to be cautious and say that their, let's just say, non-engagement into the broader scheme of things. Their focus was primarily evangelism, and that definitely filtered down if you follow some of them, their missionaries, but that's a deficiency that we want to avoid, because we want to obviously be involved in the cultures that we live in. The Methodists, the Great Awakening, again, yielded not just fruit for the kingdom, but it laid the foundation for great moral reforms in the society. This Clapham sect, put your money where your mouth is. These people did it. They were wealthy. They were zealous to serve God and honor Him, and they did it with the multitudinous societies that came out of their work, primarily the abolition of slavery, as well as other societal reforms. Modern missions coming out of this movement, just a vision, a passion, sacrifice, the cost. That's a good reason to study the missionary movement and see what these people, they sacrificed. And again, it's easy to be critical, but we got to say, wait a second, let's compare the state of affairs of what we live in and what they sacrificed in many ways. So we want to be careful about the critique of the past through the lens of contemporary politics, especially as we analyze missions movements and even their relationship with colonial governments. I'll say that again. We want to be careful to critique the past through the lens of contemporary politics, okay, as we analyze some of their contributions. And then finally, these giants, you want to read their lives. A Rebel from Bristol, I think, is the title of a nice biography of Mueller. Just his prayer, okay? And we're not all like that. You know, if I have a need, I tell people or share it. This guy just prayed and things happened. So it's very encouraging. Spurgeon, just, man, the propositional preaching, but fruit amidst the suffering he went through, the depression, the gout. And he died young, I believe 57, I think. But I think somewhere around there. But what an example. Moody, vision and outreach, a burden. And Taylor, as I mentioned when we talked about him, just the foundation laid in China. The sacrifices he went through, and it was worth it because, I don't know, we're seeing massive conversions in China, and who knows what the next 20 years will bring. So, amen.